Number 13. Zoe Reardon. As Hurricane Irma barreled toward the Florida coast in 2017, new mom Caitlin Hunt traveled to Georgia with her baby and her friend Kathy Deming to escape the storm's path. Sadly, though, the life-saving measures they took ironically ended up costing the women their lives when they were fatally struck by a Jeep while walking in downtown Woodstock. The Jeep's driver, Zoe Reardon, wasn't intoxicated or speeding at the time of the crash, leading investigators to suspect that she was simply distracted. She denied the allegation and insisted that she kept her eyes on the road the entire time she was behind the wheel. Reardon claimed that she simply didn't see the pedestrians who were wearing dark clothing after sunset and walking in an area without a designated crosswalk. The young university student maintained her innocence but pleaded guilty to several misdemeanors to avoid a trial. Due to Reardon's young age, the judge extended some leniency and spared her from jail time, instead sentencing her to 3 years of probation. She was also ordered to perform community service, and she lost her license for at least a year. And in addition, she was fined $4,000. While handing down the punishment, the judge encouraged Reardon to do at least some of her community service for a foundation dedicated to combating distracted driving. He then agreed to reduce her fine if she donated to non-profits centered around the cause. Reardon apologized at her sentencing, but the victim's loved ones felt that she was insincere and that she displayed a lack of remorse for her actions. One family member said that a phone call from the young woman would have changed everything. Another relative acknowledged that Reardon's attorney likely advised her against reaching out to the victim's loved ones. However, the same individual went on to say that the seemingly lenient consequences were an insult and failed to hold Reardon truly accountable for the tragedy. Number 12. Travis Elwell. 34-year-old Emily Javadi was loading some things into her car after a workout at a Dallas, Texas park in 2015 when a BMW slammed into her Lexus. The impact of the crash sent her flying into a metal pole, and sadly she died from her injuries. Police arrested the driver of the BMW, 23-year-old Travis Elwell, who had a blood alcohol level of 0.175, more than twice the legal limit for driving in Texas. Emily's parents were heartbroken, but a harsh jail sentence for Elwell wouldn't bring their daughter back. Working with prosecutors, they arranged a plea deal that they felt was fair. 1 week in jail every year on the anniversary of Emily's death for the next 9 years. Some might think that it seems like a generous punishment for someone who took a human life to maintain the vast majority of his freedom. But intoxication manslaughter defendants often receive probation and avoid jail time altogether. Not to mention the Javadis were actively involved in the process of creating the agreement, and it satisfied their wish for the judge to impose a consequence that would force Elwell to reflect on his actions. In addition to the annual jail visit, Elwell will remain on probation until his time is served. And during this time period, he's not allowed to drink alcohol, and he's required to attend Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and speak at drunk driving support groups. Karen Javadi told the Dallas Morning News that she thinks the terms of Elwell's probation are enough to keep his punishment from being too lenient. She also said that she hopes the young man turns his life around and becomes a better person. Number 11. Joachim Horbricks. In 2016, 35-year-old Hannah Johnson accused her husband, 56-year-old German diplomat Joachim Horbricks, of brutally assaulting her at their apartment in New York City. But there was nothing the NYPD could do about it due to diplomatic immunity laws which protected Horbricks from being arrested. The incident in question happened at the couple's Manhattan home during Horbricks' time as the assistant attaché to Germany's permanent mission to the United Nations. Johnson claimed that her husband was extremely controlling and abusive. She told the New York Post that Horbricks made her turn her phone off at 7:30 p.m. sharp every evening and that he imposed an 8:30 p.m. bedtime. And according to her version of events, Horbricks flew off the handle at her for texting a friend past her designated phone curfew. During her interview with the Post, Johnson said that the fight started when Horbricks told her it was 7:30. She asked her husband to give her another minute or two to finish what she was doing, but he allegedly erupted into a tirade. Horbricks was accused of yelling and throwing pillows at his wife and then punching her so hard that her head hit a wall. And according to Johnson, the next morning he claimed to remember nothing and apologized profusely. She reported the alleged assault to the Family Justice Center in Manhattan, who contacted the NYPD, but the police aren't allowed to apprehend someone with diplomatic immunity for any reason, based on a statement from an agency spokesperson. The mayor's office recommended going to a domestic violence shelter, but Johnson was scared to go that route because she'd been depending on her husband to provide for her throughout their 15-year marriage. Simply put, she didn't think she was tough enough to handle life at a shelter, and she had no income to support herself with. Sadly, this wasn't the first time Johnson accused Horbricks of being violent toward her. She said that her husband had a severe jealousy problem, to the point where he became envious when she showed affection toward their pet cat. And while Johnson's allegations against Horbricks were alarming, she insisted that he was a nice person who loses control of his temper, and that she didn't want him to end up losing his job over their marital issues. A neighbor backed up Johnson's claims that Horbricks had a history of domestic violence. It apparently happened quite often. In fact, according to the neighbor, the short-fused diplomat had broken the bones in his wife's face on past occasions. And when the concerned tenant went to check on Johnson during a fight, Horbricks allegedly threatened her and told her not to return. Revoking someone's diplomatic immunity is a complicated process, as the Manhattan District Attorney's Office discovered. The DA asked the Mayor's Office for International Affairs to ask the US Department of State to ask Germany to waive Horbricks' immunity. But when the German government refused, the US kicked him out of the country. Number 10. Vincent Simmons. In May of 1977, identical twins Karen and Sharon Sanders accused a 25-year-old black man named Vincent Simmons of brutally assaulting them in Marksville, Louisiana. The sisters told investigators that they were driving around with their cousin, 18-year-old Keith Laborde, when Simmons approached the trio and asked for a ride. According to the Sanders claims, Simmons instructed Laborde to turn onto a desolate dirt road, where he allegedly forced Laborde into the trunk and proceeded to attack the twins. In their complaints to the police, the sisters said that once the assaults were over, Simmons let them go. However, he threatened to come back for them if they told anyone about what had happened. Police picked him up while he was walking along the street, and he swore up and down that he didn't even know the Sanders twins. He insisted he was innocent, but was nevertheless charged in connection with the incident, and less than 2 months later, he went to trial. The trial lasted just 2 days. Simmons was convicted on all counts and was sentenced to 100 years in prison, despite the complete lack of any physical evidence against him. He worked tirelessly to petition the court to overturn his conviction, while serving hard time from behind the walls of Louisiana's notorious Angola prison. It took Simmons 16 years just to obtain a copy of his case file. And after it was finally handed over in 1993, he discovered evidence that he was never aware of, including a highly racist remark that Sharon Sanders made in her police complaint against him. Apparently, she stated that all African American people looked the same to her. Additionally, Simmons realized that he was the only man who was handcuffed in a photo showing the lineup that the Sanders twins and Keith Laborde identified him in as their alleged attacker. In 2020, 43 years into Simmons' sentence, a lawyer from New York named Justin Bonus made it his personal mission to fight for his freedom. During his investigation, he spoke with Laborde's cousin, Dana Bruyette, who accused him and the twins of lying in their reports against Simmons. In a sworn statement, she said that Laborde himself had admitted to having a consensual encounter that night with one of the twins, while the other tried to fight him off, leaving scratches on his neck. Bruyette speculated that Laborde, Karen, and Sharon made up the story about Simmons to explain away Laborde's scratches to their families. Karen Sanders eventually admitted to a consensual encounter with her cousin, but she insisted that it happened separately from the incident allegedly involving Simmons, and she, Karen, and Laborde all stuck by their original stories. Justice finally prevailed on Valentine's Day in 2022 when a judge looked at the case, along with all the new evidence that Bonus had submitted on Simmons' behalf. Amazingly, his conviction was overturned, and he was promptly released from prison later that evening, 3 days before his 70th birthday. While Simmons can't get back the more than 4 decades of his life that he spent behind bars, he told 48 Hours that he's making the most out of his freedom as he adjusts to life on the outside and learns how to use modern technology. Number 9. Sean Tonkin. 42-year-old John Mike Roan Jr. was standing outside a liquor store in Kansas City, Missouri on the 2023 4th of July holiday when a white man approached him and began hurling threats and racial slurs at him for no apparent reason. The suspect, later identified as 36-year-old Sean W. Tonkin, could be seen disappearing behind the store in surveillance footage while Roan followed behind him with a club-like object in his hand. Then, just moments later, Roan stumbled backwards, uttered, "He stabbed me," and fell to the ground. Sadly, he died from 2 fatal stab wounds to his chest. Tonkin fled the scene and was apprehended about a half hour later by police. And while authorities have condemned his racist behavior, they've only charged him with a misdemeanor count of disturbing the peace and a low-level felony drug possession count for methamphetamine. Officials told the press that they wanted to investigate more to determine who started the altercation, what types of weapons were used, and how Missouri's Stand Your Ground law may or may not apply to the incident. Witnesses have reportedly accused Tonkin of starting the fight, according to Roan's sister, who told Newsweek that the tragedy hits home because her brother didn't judge people according to color. She said that their family is blended and pointed out that her brother's girlfriend, Misty Beck, is white. Misty was with Roan on the day of the stabbing. They were joined by a group of friends at the liquor store where they often hung out and played slots together. Speaking with Newsweek, Misty said that she overheard someone yelling a racial slur while Roan was retrieving something from his car. She then said she went outside to see what was going on and found the 2 men in the midst of a disagreement. Misty said she tried getting Roan to come inside, but he reassured her that he had the situation under control. But shortly after that, a woman ran inside the store yelling for someone to call 911. Missouri's Stand Your Ground law states that lethal force can be used against someone when a person believes it's necessary to defend themselves or a third person. And that even applies in certain cases where the person who uses the force was the initial aggressor. Prosecutors have still not given a definitive answer about whether or not they plan to pursue charges against Tonkin for taking Roan's life. But as more time passes, people are becoming increasingly fearful that the suspect won't be held accountable. Number 8. Lance Saltzman. In his early years, Lance Saltzman endured a traumatic brain injury after a pit bull attack. As a teenager, he struggled with an untreated drug addiction, leading him to drop out of high school after just 9th grade. Subsequently, he acquired a record of misdemeanor convictions, including driving with a revoked license, providing a false name, marijuana possession, petty theft, and trespassing. Lance's life took a darker turn when he was convicted of felony burglary, resulting in a 2-year prison sentence. In March 2006, at the age of 21, a distressing incident occurred in Lance's family home in Palm Beach County, Florida. His stepfather brandished a gun during an argument with Lance's mother, fortunately without harm. Although the police took the firearm away, it was later returned to his stepfather, leading to renewed threats against Lance's mother. Fearful for his mother's safety, Lance took the drastic step of removing the gun from his parents' bedroom, an action his mother later deemed life-saving. Tragically, though, he made the mistake of selling the gun to a friend, who then used it in an armed burglary. Consequently, Lance faced charges of armed robbery and theft of a firearm for removing the gun from his own home. Moreover, due to his prior felon status, he was charged with being in possession of a firearm and for being connected to the crimes his friend committed using the gun, despite not being directly involved. The prosecution offered Lance a plea deal carrying a 5-year prison sentence, which he declined, subjecting him to Florida's Prison Release Reoffender Act. Under this law, the maximum sentence is imposed on those convicted of certain felonies within 3 years of release from prison. This meant Lance faced a potential lifetime sentence, a penalty many deemed excessively harsh for a young man with a troubled past. Throughout the legal proceedings, Lance's loved ones pleaded for leniency, emphasizing the circumstances surrounding the gun incident. However, their efforts were unsuccessful, and in 2007, Lance was sentenced to life imprisonment in the Florida state prison system. Records indicate that Lance was released from custody in 2017, though the details surrounding his release remain unclear. It appears that his sentences were eventually reduced, leading to a different outcome in his case. Lance Saltzman was trying to protect his mom when he stole his stepdad's gun, but at the end of the day, the law is the law. Number 7. Issei Sagava. While studying at the University of Sorbonne in France as a PhD candidate in 1981, 32-year-old Issei Sagava had an increasingly difficult time ignoring his lifelong urge to eat human flesh. And when he could no longer fight the compulsion, he asked fellow scholar René Hartevelt to tutor him in German at his apartment. The unsuspecting 25-year-old was happy to help, but during their study session, Sagava snuck up on René from behind and fatally shot her in the neck. Then, after trying to eat multiple parts of the victim's decomposing body over a several-day period, he packed her dismembered remains into 2 suitcases and headed to a nearby pond with plans to dump the luggage. But witnesses caught him trying to dispose of René's body and alerted authorities, who promptly took Sagava into custody. Mental health experts declared him legally insane and unfit to stand trial, so he was deported back to Japan. Sagava was then placed in a mental hospital for observation, and Japanese experts declared him sane. They also concluded that he committed the horrifying act deliberately and out of perversion, rather than any sort of disconnect with reality. But when Japanese authorities tried to prosecute Sagava for the crime, France refused to hand over the sealed court documents relating to the case. And without any evidence, it was impossible to charge him. So Sagava walked free, and for many years he profited off his gruesome story and his notoriety in general. During a 2009 interview with Vice magazine, Sagava described his desire to eat human flesh as similar to a normal man's desire to kiss someone they're attracted to. Thankfully, though, he never killed again, at least as far as we know. Sagava passed away from pneumonia in November 2022 at the age of 73. Number 6. Lamar Johnson. Marcus Boyd was chatting with a friend on the front porch of his St. Louis, Missouri home one evening in 1994 when 2 masked men approached and shot him dead. While speaking with the police, the victim's girlfriend mentioned that she thought Boyd recently had a falling out with his friend, 20-year-old Lamar Johnson. At the time, Johnson was a father of 2 and a college student who was working full-time to support his family. And to make ends meet, he was a small-time drug dealer on the side. Johnson told investigators that he and his girlfriend were a few miles away at a friend's house when Boyd was shot. His girlfriend claimed that he only left once to make a quick drug sale and that he'd returned to the house by the time she finished changing their baby's diaper. Johnson's brief absence was enough to land him on the suspect list. Meanwhile, Boyd's friend who'd witnessed the shooting and survived, Greg Elking, told detectives that he didn't think he could pick the suspects out of a lineup. They were wearing masks, and at the time of the crime, it was nighttime, so he couldn't see clearly. Investigators urged Elking to choose a photo, and he landed on Johnson while continuing to say that he truly wasn't sure if he was picking the right person. And when he was asked to sign a photo marking his selection, he refused. Several days later, police arrested Johnson, and Elking was asked to choose the shooter out of a live lineup. He once again hesitated to pick someone, and when he finally made a selection, it was someone other than Johnson. Authorities nevertheless charged Johnson and his friend Philip Campbell and featured Elking as the star witness in the trial. The prosecution also argued their case based on shaky testimony from an unreliable jailhouse informant. Johnson's girlfriend took the stand in his defense, vouching that she was with him on the night of the shooting. The jury nevertheless found Johnson guilty after deliberating for just 2 hours, and he was sentenced to life without parole. Campbell was also convicted in connection with the crime, and over the following years, he admitted to being one of the men who was actually at the shooting. In a letter to Johnson, Campbell clearly stated that Johnson wasn't involved and listed a man named James B.A. Howard as his co-conspirator. Then in 2003, Elking admitted that he falsely incriminated Johnson during the trial. He also confessed to receiving financial help and assistance moving from law enforcement in exchange for his cooperation with the case. Over the years, Johnson fought tirelessly to have his case revisited in court. And finally, in 2018, it caught the attention of St. Louis Circuit Attorney Kimberly Gardner, who leads a conviction integrity unit. While reviewing the case, the team discovered even more red flags pointing toward a wrongful conviction, including the fact that the jailhouse informant who testified against Johnson was extremely racist. Investigators also discovered that Johnson didn't have nearly enough time to drive to Boyd's home, commit the shooting, and return to his friend's house in the amount of time his girlfriend said he was gone that evening. Despite the mounting evidence in his favor, though, Johnson's repeated attempts to have the case reviewed by someone with the power to free him were repeatedly denied. But he finally got his day in court in 2021, thanks to a new law giving prosecutors expanded power to bring suspected wrongful conviction cases to court. Johnson was granted a new hearing in late 2022, and it lasted for 5 days. Then 2 months later, the judge called everyone back to the courtroom to announce his decision. After spending 28 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, Johnson's conviction was overturned, and he walked away a free man. Number 5. Anne Sakulas. 19-year-old Harry Dunn was an experienced and responsible motorcycle rider who lost his life by no fault of his own in August 2019 when his bike collided with a car that was traveling on the wrong side of the road in Northamptonshire, England. The driver who struck Harry was identified as Anne Sakulas, a US government employee and the wife of an American diplomat. Shortly before the accident, she'd pulled out of the nearby RAF Croughton base, which operates as a US Air Force communications station. Sakulas had only been in the UK for 3 weeks, indicating that perhaps she drove on the wrong side of the road out of habit. Regardless, though, she cooperated with police at the scene and passed a breathalyzer. During a subsequent interview at Sakulas' home, she mentioned that she had diplomatic immunity, so the Northamptonshire police applied for a waiver, which would enable authorities to pursue criminal charges. However, United States officials denied the waiver, and Sakulas returned to America without facing any immediate consequences for her role in the deadly crash. She insisted that the tragedy was merely an accident, but Harry's family wanted the British court to make that determination. Police told Harry's mother, Charlotte Charles, that there was a less than 1% chance of anyone being held accountable for her son's death. But as long as that sliver of a chance was there, Charlotte was going to fight for justice. Over the next 3 years, Harry's family waged an unrelenting campaign for Sakulas to face charges in Britain. The US rejected the UK's request to waive Sakulas' diplomatic immunity, but Harry's loved ones continued fighting. His mother even traveled to America to meet with then-President Donald Trump, although the meeting didn't go as well as she'd hoped. The Justice for Harry campaign's leaders always tried to keep an open dialogue with the American and British governments, but the situation unavoidably stirred tensions between the two countries. When the US refused to waive Sakulas' immunity, critics speculated that she was being afforded extra protection due to her past work for the CIA. Activists then called on British officials to go tit for tat and to deny the Americans' ongoing attempts to extradite WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange from the UK. And when Sakulas refused to willingly return to Great Britain, Harry's parents filed a wrongful death lawsuit in US civil court. After more than 3 years of back and forth between the countries, Sakulas faced a British court from the US over video chat. She pleaded guilty to causing death by careless driving and received a suspended prison sentence and an 8-month driving ban. And while this meant that she'd face no serious consequences, especially if she stayed out of the UK, just knowing that she now had a criminal record in Britain was enough for Harry's family to finally feel like some measure of justice had been served. Number 4. Andre McDonald. 29-year-old Andreen McDonald was reported missing after she failed to show up for work one weekend in early 2019. Knowing that the young mother would never voluntarily abandon her child, pretty much everyone in Andreen's life immediately grew concerned for her well-being. except for her husband, 40-year-old U.S. Air Force Major Andre McDonald. He refused to cooperate with authorities when they showed up at the couple's home in San Antonio to execute a search warrant on the property. During the search, investigators recovered a handful of recently purchased items that led them to believe Andre planned to dispose of a body, including a shovel, an axe, work gloves, and gasoline. McDonald was charged with evidence tampering after he allegedly ripped up a receipt for the items. However, authorities still lacked enough evidence to charge him with murder, even though they were pretty sure that Andreen was dead and that Andre had killed her. 5 months later, Andreen's mostly skeletal remains were found hidden beneath a cow carcass on a remote property 5 miles from the McDonald's home. Andre was charged with his wife's murder in July of 2019, but he remained silent about the case until he took the stand in his own defense at his trial in early 2023. During the long-awaited testimony, McDonald revealed that he and Andreen had fought over money and issues relating to their jointly shared business after a visit to a tax preparer. He said he left the house for several hours so that he and Andreen could both cool off. But the argument continued when he returned in the middle of the night. Andre claimed that his wife spat in his face and attacked him and that he killed her in self-defense. He admitted to tripping Andreen and kicking her at least twice after she fell onto the floor, and he knowingly left the room to distract their child while he heard her wheezing. And when he returned to the room, Andreen was dead. Instead of dialing 911 though, which is what people normally do during an emergency, McDonald began sending text messages to himself from Andreen's phone to make it seem like she left the house voluntarily. He then wrapped his wife's remains in garbage bags and dumped them near the cow carcass, but he returned a few days later to bash the claw end of a hammer into Andreen's head and face out of anger for supposedly putting him in his current predicament. Andre didn't have enough gasoline to burn Andreen's body, so he hid it beneath the dead cow. McDonald's lawyer argued that his client wasn't guilty of murder because he didn't mean to kill his wife. The jury agreed, and Andre McDonald was convicted of the lesser charge of manslaughter. And while the judge imposed a maximum sentence of 20 years, it was a far cry from justice in the eyes of Andreen's family, who told the press that they believed McDonald acted with the intention to kill the victim. Number 3. Timothy Tyler. A significant portion of Americans believe that mandatory life sentences should be reserved for the most violent criminals, and many are against mandatory minimums altogether. However, during the 1980s war on drugs, federal lawmakers took a different approach, enacting mandatory minimum sentences in response to the crack cocaine epidemic. Among these laws was the 3 strikes policy, which imposed life sentences for 3 non-violent drug-related felony convictions. In 1991, 24-year-old Timothy Tyler was arrested twice for selling LSD and later unknowingly sent the drug to a federal informant, leading to his 3rd arrest. He pleaded guilty to possession with intent to deliver and conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute. Unfortunately, though, Tyler didn't realize the gravity of the situation until after the fact, as he was hit with 2 mandatory life sentences without parole. While Tyler had committed a crime and was aware of the illegality of his actions, he had no history of violence and struggled with mental health issues. Those who knew him considered him to be harmless, leading to their disbelief that he'd receive life sentences, while some murderers were eligible for parole. Tyler's loved ones and supporters tirelessly advocated for his release during his over 24 years behind bars. He garnered the support of high-ranking politicians, including Senator Rand Paul. And in addition, a petition with over 400,000 signatures urged President Barack Obama to grant Tyler clemency. Finally, in 2016, Obama granted him clemency, and after 2 more years in prison, Tyler was released in 2018. The phrase, "do the crime, do the time," implies that if one knowingly breaks the law, they should accept the consequences. But in Tyler's case, his release sparked a debate about the appropriateness of mandatory life sentences for non-violent offenses. Number 2. Angie Lee Tao. In early 2022, 23-year-old Angie Lee Tao was arrested on several DUI-related charges after she crashed her vehicle and injured someone in Fresno, California, while driving drunk. And police reports noted that her blood alcohol content was more than 3 times the legal limit at the time of the accident. Prosecutor Stephen Yultson urged the judge to mandate Tao to an alcohol monitoring system, but he released the suspect with a strict warning not to drink and drive. Tao's case was still pending 7 months later when she drove drunk yet again and ran right through a stop sign. The passenger side of her car was T-boned by a pickup truck that had the right of way, killing her passenger, 38-year-old Yang Vu. This time, authorities charged Tao with vehicular manslaughter while intoxicated, DUI with a blood alcohol concentration of 0.08 or more causing injury, and DUI while causing injury. And according to police reports, she had a blood alcohol content of 0.12 at the time of the crash. Drunk drivers in California typically receive something called a Watson statement after being convicted of their first DUI. The statement is a warning that if they drive drunk again and kill someone, they'll be charged with murder rather than manslaughter. But because Tao hadn't yet been convicted of her first DUI charge, she hadn't received a Watson statement when she got into her second drunk driving accident. She ultimately pleaded no contest to all charges and was sentenced to 6 years and 8 months in prison. And at her sentencing, Tao tearfully apologized to Yang Vu's family and to her own loved ones. But to Vu's longtime girlfriend, Ki Vang, the sentence was a mere slap on the wrist. Speaking with the Fresno Bee, Vang explained that her grieving process had been complicated. She didn't know why her boyfriend of 17 years was with Tao during the early morning hours. And she was also still grappling with receiving a phone call from police who told her that Vu's girlfriend had been driving the vehicle at the time of the accident, indicating that Vu and Tao may have been romantically involved in some way. Number 1. Tony Peralta. 69-year-old William Blodgett went missing in Roswell, New Mexico at the end of 2008. His vehicle was left parked outside his home, and his bank activity stopped completely. There were no outward signs of foul play, and it was as if he'd vanished into thin air. While investigating the senior citizen's disappearance, police questioned his tenant, a man in his early 20s, named Tony Peralta. They learned that Blodgett had recently tried to evict Peralta, but the conversation failed to generate any additional information. Investigators considered Peralta to be a possible suspect, but with no solid leads to go on, the case went cold. After conducting interviews and searching Blodgett's home and neighborhood, authorities concluded that there was nothing else they could do to try locating the elderly gentleman. They declared the case closed until or unless they received information that would justify reopening it. And in the meantime, Blodgett's loved ones had no choice but to live without answers. 14 years later, in 2023, Tony Peralta entered a convenience store and borrowed a stranger's phone. He called the police, said he'd killed someone, and requested to speak with a member of law enforcement. Officers then arrived to find him sitting on a curb and smoking a cigarette. Peralta confessed to killing Blodgett with a screwdriver in a meth-induced rage. He admitted he didn't have an excuse for his actions and revealed that he'd buried Blodgett's body beneath his floorboards. At first, officers wondered if Peralta was pulling their leg. They asked him a lot of questions, including why he'd finally decided to come forward and if he was going to lead them on a wild goose chase for Blodgett's remains. Peralta said that the guilt over his crime had been eating away at him for years and that he could no longer deal with having it on his conscience. He accompanied police to the home where he claimed he buried Blodgett's body, and sure enough, they dug up a shoe, several bones, and some dentures. The discovery came as a surprise, especially since law enforcement had searched the property with a cadaver dog during the earlier days of Blodgett's disappearance. In the end, authorities charged Peralta with murder. He pleaded not guilty, which is a customary thing to do during the early stages of a criminal case, and he remains behind bars while awaiting his next court date. On one hand, it's frustrating that he got to enjoy nearly 15 years of freedom after killing his landlord in cold blood. But as the saying goes, it's better late than never, and at least he finally came forward and did the right thing. Would you rather be a juror in a case that convicted an innocent person, or one where a serial killer was set free? Let us know what you would choose in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.